Do you think it's murder, abortion?
I have my opinions on it, but I'd rather not comment on it.
You said you're very pro-life. Pro-life
I
view
am
is that
pro-life.
it's abortion.
Yeah, I'm
abortion
pro-life.
is
Yeah,
murder.
but I mean, I do have my opinions on it. I just don't think it's an appropriate forum.
But you don't disagree with that proposition, that it's murder?
What proposition?
That abortion is murder.
No, I don't disagree with it.
I'm punishing anybody for having an abortion.
Okay, fine. Okay,
Of
that's
course
fine.
not.
And
I think it's a woman's choice.
so you're against the teachings of your church?
I believe, I have a view, and a moral view, but I believe we live in a free country, and I don't want to live in a country so fascistic that it can stop a person from making that decision.
But then
that would be so invasive,
I know, but I've heard
so
you
determinative of
speaking.
society.
In this instance, the Supreme Court has withdrawn protection for the human rights of unborn children, and it is teaching people that abortion is a rather innocuous procedure provided that there are proper legal safeguards. I think that the judgment of the court will do a great deal to tear down the respect previously accorded human life in our culture.
And do you believe there is such a thing as sin?
Well, I think the greatest sin in the world is bringing children into the world that have disease from their parents, that have no chance in the world to be a human being, practically. Delinquents, prisoners, all sorts of things just marked when they're born. That, to me, is the greatest sin.
But
Do you believe in punishment for abortion? Yes or no, as a principle?
The answer is that there has to be some form of punishment.
For the woman?
Yeah, there has to be some form.
10
Let me
cents,
just
10
tell you,
years,
I don't
what?
know. That I don't know.
To raise the dignity of woman and give her freedom of choice in this area is an extraordinary event.
Birth control. It's been a controversial topic for over 150 years. One of the first activists for the spread and use of birth control was Margaret Sanger. She was one of the most influential people during the American reproductive rights movement, also known as the contraceptive or birth control movement. Margaret's interest in women's birth control is said to have originated from what her mother went through.
I think from the very beginning, I came of a large family. My mother died young, 11 children. That made an impression on me as a child. I was a trained nurse, went among the people. I saw women who asked to have some means whereby they wouldn't have to have another pregnancy too early after the last child, the last abortion, which many of them had. So there's a number of things that are one after the other that really made you feel.
Margaret Sanger began her work when she wrote a newspaper column titled What Every Girl Should Know. 2 years later, she began The Woman Rebel, a newsletter that educated women about birth control. At the time, this was illegal. The Comstock laws created in 1873 made it illegal to sell, publish, and possess what was considered obscene material at the time. To avoid up to a 5-year prison sentence, Margaret fled to England. During her time there, she studied and learned about different forms of birth control. Margaret returned to America a year later when the charges were dropped. In 1916, Margaret opened the first ever birth control clinic in Brooklyn, New York. 10 days after it opened, Margaret and her staff were arrested for violating the Comstock laws. During those first 10 days, the clinic saw close to 500 women. Margaret and her sister, who worked at the clinic, were in jail for 30 days. Later, Margaret appealed her conviction. The court would not change the previous ruling, but they created an exception in the current law. This exception allowed doctors to prescribe contraception to their patients if medically necessary. In 1921, Margaret Sanger created the American Birth Control League, an early version of Planned Parenthood, and in 1923 she opened another birth control clinic, this time legally. Margaret's clinic served as a template for other clinics, and by 1938 there were more than 300 birth control clinics across the nation. Another big triumph for Margaret happened the same year, when the federal obscenity ban on birth control was lifted. But even after the ban was terminated, contraception was still illegal in many states for years to come. An important landmark in birth control pioneered by Margaret Sanger was the introduction of the first oral contraceptive, Enovid, in 1960. Sanger thought of and created the pill with Gregory Pincus and other supporters. In the 1965 case, Griswold v. Connecticut, married couples were given the right to use contraceptives. The previous law stated that any person who used an instrument, medical object, or drug would be fined and possibly imprisoned. The Supreme Court stated that the previous ban infringed on people's right to marital privacy. Almost 10 years later, the Baird v. Eindestedt case in 1972 made it legal for all Americans to use contraceptives, not solely married people.
My grandmother had 7 kids, and it was during the Depression, and it was, they were going hungry, and she got pregnant with her 8th child, and she went to one of those back alley abortionists, and she got an infection and died. And she left 7 kids behind, ranging from like a toddler to 17. And it was really hard on the family, and that was one reason that my dad had to quit. He finally had to quit and come back and help his dad support these kids, and that was one reason he stayed a logger. And then it was really hard for the girls, because there were 4 girls, and then they didn't have a mother. And their dad was, he worked as a logger, and then he worked in a mill, I think, for a while. So he wasn't making big bucks. It was during the Depression, and times were hard.
Before Roe v. Wade, Texas law only allowed a woman to have an abortion to save her life. Even a victim of incest or rape could not have an abortion at the time. Jane Roe, whose real name was Norma McCorvey, said that because of financial restrictions, Texas law forced her to have a child or go to an unfit doctor. Her case was argued in front of the Supreme Court on October 11, 1972.
We are not here to advocate abortion. We do not ask this court to rule that abortion is good or desirable in any particular situation. We are here to advocate that the decision as to whether or not a particular woman will continue to carry or will terminate a pregnancy is a decision that should be made by that individual. That in fact she has a constitutional right to make that decision for herself.
The Supreme Court ruled in her favor, and in 1973 abortion was legalized.
Good evening. In a landmark ruling, the Supreme Court today legalized abortions. The majority in cases from Texas and Georgia said that the decision to end a pregnancy during the first 3 months belongs to the woman and her doctor, not the government. Thus, the anti-abortion laws of 46 states were rendered unconstitutional.
Roe v. Wade was yet another milestone for the pro-choice movement. However, by the time abortion was legalized, Norma McCorvey had already had the baby and put it up for adoption. Nevertheless, Roe v. Wade has enabled women to have safe abortions for almost 50 years. Today, the fight is not over. When it comes to abortion, pro-choice and pro-life advocates are still fighting to keep their beliefs heard and enforced. Although there have been many victories for women's birth control rights, conflict still continues.
We will continue to educate, and we will continue to fight for the unborn.
Pro-life advocates have come up with more creative ways than ever to make it harder to have an abortion. In 2013, lawmakers proposed restrictions in 36 states to make access to abortion more difficult. These restrictions are called TRAP laws, short for Targeted Regulation of Abortion Providers, and they make it very difficult for facilities that provide abortions to stay in business. Besides the fact that abortions are 99% safe, TRAP laws do not target the medical safety of the procedure. Some of them include requirements for the length of the grass outside, the size of a janitor's closet, and room temperature. When a real abortion clinic is shut down in violation of TRAP laws, it is often replaced by a pro-life clinic. These clinics are called crisis pregnancy centers and are designed to convince women not to have an abortion.
It's estimated that as of 2014, crisis pregnancy centers outnumber abortion clinics 5-1, making access to abortion more difficult than ever.
No matter the tactics used to deter women from abortions, it is still their constitutional right to have one. Women have the right to bodily integrity and the right to privacy, which grants them their freedom of choice when it comes to abortion. Abortions have given women in America financial and professional stability, as well as a better quality of life. Contraception, especially abortions, continue to contain conflict. Conflict around this topic may never end, but we need to respect the constitutional rights of women.